What are your odds of getting into a film festival? 10%? 1%? Well, guess no further, because today I am going to show you all of the submission data from the 2025 Wyoming International Film Festival. I'm also going to show you the odds of getting into the Big Five: Sundance, TIFF, Berlin, Venice, and Cannes, as well as share some more submission data from other festivals I found. I'm Rudy Womack, and welcome to the Film Festival Guide. Just yesterday, the Wyoming International Film Festival published all of its submission data for the 2025 event. Now, we have published our data for the past couple of years, but this year we've gone more in-depth than ever before. How can indie filmmakers use this data to their advantage? Well, admittedly, this is a data set from only one film festival, so it is a little bit limited. However, you can extrapolate a lot of what I am going to show you here today and apply it to other film festivals of a similar size to WyoIFF. And if you're asking yourself, how do film festivals even select films in the first place? Well, I made an in-depth video about that very topic, link in the description below. Okay, let's jump in. Acceptance rate. This past season, the Wyoming International Film Festival had a 24% acceptance rate with 622 total submissions, 148 selections, and 474 rejections. That alone is more data than most film festivals ever release, but it doesn't tell the entire story. The festival actually screened 177 films in total, with the balance being made up by the Wyoming Dance Film Festival and the Wyoming 48-Hour Film Fest. Because those are special categories that are not applicable to most filmmakers, we didn't include it in this data set. And speaking of data, my analytics show 90% of you who are watching this are not subscribed. I'm the only person on YouTube bringing you these critical deep dives into film festivals. So if you find this information helpful, please support the channel with a like and subscribe. Thank you very much. Moving on to film origins, we have included data for submissions and selections by region. Couple of things to point out. We are a US-based festival, so it kind of makes sense that most of our submissions and selections come from the United States. There's also something else that's pretty noteworthy here. If you look at submissions, we received 24 films from Wyoming. Over here in selections, we screened 15. This is a 62% acceptance rate for local films, more than 2.5 times the total acceptance rate for the entire film festival. Indie filmmakers, I am talking to you. Local and regional film festivals are going to be your biggest champions. Next up are submissions and selections by deadline. As most of you already know, submitting earlier is better, and this data set supports it. Surprisingly, our earliest deadline, which we call Discount Week, did not have the most submissions, but it did in fact have the most selections. Also surprising, our Early Bird deadline, which did have the most submissions, was actually third when it came to selections. Now, I have no idea why this is, and the programming team and I will be reviewing some of our practices to make sure there aren't any blind spots that we're totally unaware of. Last thing I want to point out is final deadline. Filmmakers always ask if it's worth even submitting to the final deadline, and this data shows 14 selections from 70 submissions, or a 20% acceptance rate. Slightly less than the overall film festival, but actually not bad. It essentially means if you submit on a late deadline, you have about a 1 in 5 chance of getting in. Over here are selections by runtime. We broke it down in 5-minute increments for short films, and at the very end over here, we have feature films with a total of 15 selected for last year's festival. As can be expected, if you apply a bell curve to the short films, you see a pretty normal distribution, with films in the 10 to 15 minute range making up the majority of selections, while films under 5 minutes and over 20 minutes making up the least number of selections. I don't think this data really shows us anything we don't already know. If you make a short film, 15 minutes tends to be the sweet spot. That said, I was a bit surprised to see how many films in the 15 15 to 20 minute range were selected, although I would bet most of these fall closer to the 15-minute end instead of the 20-minute end. Moving on to category, we have both submissions and selections. Straight out of the gate, we can see narrative shorts are the bulk of both our submissions and selections, but surprising to me was the little red area here. That's short documentaries, 59 submissions and 21 selections. That's a 35% acceptance rate for short documentaries. Now, I'm personally a bit conflicted. I would like to start showing more short documentaries at the festival, but looking at the data here compared to other categories, they are a bit outsized, which means you can bet that we will be reviewing this for the 2026 Film Festival. And here's a bit of a warning for feature filmmakers. Looking at the narrative feature and documentary feature categories, you can see 91 and 58 submissions respectively. That's a total of 149 feature submissions. But for selections, those numbers are 8 and 4. 13 feature selections out of 149, or 8.7 acceptance rate. That means if you are a feature filmmaker submitting your film to festivals of a similar size or structure as the Wyoming International Film Festival, you should definitely do your research before submitting. Make sure the festival has programmed films like yours in the past, otherwise you are going to have some incredibly stiff competition to get in. Quick aside, earlier I mentioned there were 15 features at the Wyoming International Film Festival, but right now I just said there were 13. The difference comes from Wyoming-made feature films, which were not put into the feature categories, but into the Wyoming categories specifically. Just in case you were wondering if there was a discrepancy in the data. One last thing I want to point out here, web series. 5 submissions, 2 selections, 40% acceptance rate. Good for you, web people. Few, but mighty. Last up here is submissions by pay. YOIFF received 533 blind submissions, which means these filmmakers paid the full amount and had no prior connection to the festival. From that pool, we accepted 128 films. I'm gonna be honest with you, I feel like most film festivals that are the same age as YOIFF don't accept as many blind submissions. I feel like they get a lot more alumni submissions and tend to favor those over blind submissions. Of note here are waivers. We issued 44 waivers, but only selected 3, which means in total, out of 148 films in the festival, 145 had to pay some kind of submission fee. Well, that covers the Wyoming International Film Festival, but I did a little bit of digging into the Big 5, and what I found might surprise you. Sundance regularly receives between 15 and 17,000 submissions, typically screening about 150 to 200 films. This comes out to about a 1% acceptance rate. The Toronto International Film Festival regularly receives about 7,000 to 9,000 submissions, screening anywhere from 250 to 300 films. That's about a 3% acceptance rate, give or take. In 2025, Berlin received 8,000 submissions and screened 400 films. But that's counting everything, not just the films that are in competition, but also the films outside of the competition. That comes out to about a 5% acceptance rate. The Venice Film Festival is brutal, screening somewhere in the neighborhood of 60 features out of 7,000 to 8,000 submissions. That's a 0.08 acceptance rate, not even a full percent. Cannes was the hardest to pin down because they have so many sidebars and special categories and films in competition and not in competition. But in general, Cannes has about 150 selections with about 10,000 submissions, around 1 to 2% acceptance rate. None of these numbers factor in which films were invited versus which films were blind submissions. It doesn't factor in shorts versus features, studio films versus independent films. So for the majority of filmmakers, these percentages are actually going to be a lot lower. To put things into perspective, Harvard has a 3 to 4% acceptance rate, meaning it's easier to get into one of the top schools in the world than it is to get into most of the Big 5 film festivals. But the Big 5 aren't the only festivals in the world, and I did a little bit of research and found some information about some other film festivals. Winter Film Festival in New York published this graph showing the runtimes of all their submissions, what percent of submissions had that runtime, what percent were selected, and what the acceptance rate was. Notably, films with a runtime of 0 to 5 minutes had the highest acceptance rate of 29.9%. That's quite different than what we have over at Wyoming, which just goes to show you every film festival is going to have their own particular preferences. Utah International Film Festival published something very similar. Their data is showing a little bit more consistency across the 0 to 5, 6 to 10, and 11 to 15 minute run times. I should note, according to their Film Freeway, they received 875 submissions and programmed 250 films, giving them a 28% acceptance rate. San Francisco IndieFest received 862 submissions, which was an 11.5% increase from 2024. They screened 77 films, which means a 9% overall acceptance rate, but they broke it down further, selecting 27 features from 215 feature submissions. That's a 12.5% acceptance rate for feature films. For shorts, they screened 50 films from 647 submissions, which is about a 7.7% acceptance rate for short films. FilmQuest in 2025 noted a 30% increase in their submissions, receiving approximately 2,300 films. They selected about 300 films, which gives FilmQuest a 13% acceptance rate. I once spoke with some folks over at Salute Your Shorts, and they told me they regularly receive about 1,500 to 2,000 submissions, programming 50 films. That's between a 2.5 and 3% acceptance rate. Now, I would love to share more data, but unfortunately, that's kind of all I've found. Film festivals don't really publish this sort of data, so it's very difficult to find it. Now, some festivals publish their numbers on Film Freeway, but in my experience, it's a mixed bag. Sometimes those numbers are trustworthy, and sometimes they're either inflated or even deflated to make them look better. In fact, even just going to Google and searching film festival data, the only film festival that reliably keeps popping up is the Wyoming International Film Festival. So I hope you found all of this information helpful, and remember, you can help me out by subscribing to this channel. Now, I'd love to hear from you down in the comments below. Was there any data that was surprising or unexpected for you? As always, I have some more great videos that are going to be dropping here in the next couple of weeks, but until then, I'll see you on the circuit.